Hey viewers, my name's Cara. I am finally going to do a video weighing in on this idea or topic of where are the advanced books in witchcraft. This is a topic that was brought up to me much earlier this year, last year, I don't even remember. And I remember talking to Danny Lang of Esoteric Moment, formerly of the Pagan Perspective, about it in the comments of a video, but I don't really remember where it came up. But Thorn Mooney posted a video earlier today, which I just saw, that reminded me that I hadn't done a video about this topic yet. And so I hadn't decided what I was going to do for this week's video, so I thought, perfect time to jump in and talk about this advanced book sort of thing. So Thorn's video about advanced books earlier this year is fantastic and talks about, the fact that what is going to be advanced for you depends entirely on what you are looking to do, what your end goal is. And that is very similar to what I've been telling people essentially. When I think of advanced books, I have sort of come to the conclusion that what is going to fulfill the role of being an advanced book for someone is not necessarily going to say the word advanced on the cover, because it's going to depend on that person's journey. For example, and this might seem like a really strange example, but I think that there are topics or areas of interest, areas of study, practice, etc., that one person may see as completely beginner, and for another person, that same beginner subject might be more intermediate or advanced. And that's because it depends on what they've been introduced to. Again, this might seem like a weird example, but for example, for me, I was brought up from the time I was really young, learning about basic meditation stuff, meditation practices, group meditation, guided meditation. And then as I got older, I learned different types of things and, moving beyond the idea of meditation as sitting perfectly still and being perfectly silent, right? But learning further aspects of meditation. Someone else who has had absolutely no experience with that, but has been practicing basics of, neo-pagan magic or whatever the case may be, later on in their life, they may have the opportunity to start learning about meditation. And although they would be learning things that are very basic that I might have learned as a 10-year-old, this person could be learning them at a more advanced place in their practice, because maybe they've been learning about other things entirely and they now want to add meditation to their practice as a way of deepening their practice. So they would have to then be going to the beginning of that subject. Whereas for people like me who have been doing it forever, we might not think of meditation as an advanced topic or an intermediate topic. When I talk about this, I'm basically just saying like beyond beginner, once you're past the point where you no longer feel like you're a beginner and you're in that stage of what's next. So that's kind of what I'm thinking of. Whether we would label it intermediate or advanced is a separate subject. But there's this idea for me that, for example, certain things that I haven't yet touched on in my practice, or that I didn't touch on in the first 10 years of my practice, there might be a time where I decide, okay, now I think it's time for me to bring this in because I've got all this other stuff in my foundation. It might be time to bring in this other concept. And so for me, that is an act of deepening or furthering my practice. Whereas for someone else who started with that practice, they might see it as completely beginner. So I think there is one element of having to realize when we are judging whether something is beginner, intermediate, or advanced based on when we got to it. Because that's not always going to help other people. realizing that that is a completely subjective way of looking at it, I'm basically saying that anything can be seen as beginner versus more advanced depending on when you learned about it, when you were taught it, and even in the act of furthering or advancing our personal practice, we might be bringing in something entirely new. And when we're doing that entirely new thing, that thing that is entirely new to us, we have to go back to the beginning of that new thing, So we may decide to add in a new aspect to our practice and become a beginner in that aspect of practice, even though it is a part of what we consider the intermediate step or the next step on our path. Do you know what I mean? Is this making sense? Anyway, recognizing that that's completely subjective and it depends. I know that what a lot of people are asking about is literally, where are the books that say they're about advanced witchcraft? How do we find those books? And what Thorn talked about in their video was ridiculously helpful, of course, so go and watch that. But also Thorn's video today was talking about Laura Tempest Zakroff, her new book, Weave the Liminal, people considering it a beginner book, where that is not what it was intended to be and not how the author themselves sees it. As I recall, in my video about Weave the Liminal, I referred to it as beginner friendly. And that is a term that I've been using more often. To me, it does mean something different than beginner. Being beginner friendly, to me, sort of says that you don't necessarily already have to have the beginning foundation of other stuff, because this book isn't specifically building on those foundational materials. This book is talking about other subjects within this world that could be appropriate for a beginner. But again, it's, sometimes like with Weave the Liminal, it's me looking back and saying, this stuff, if I had been reading it when I was a beginner, would have been really helpful to me and might have helped me grasp certain concepts sooner, or it might have helped me establish my personal direction and sort of the way that I think about things a little sooner. But it is not a beginner book. And so what we all think of as a beginner book, I think widely differs, but I do remember talking to Danny Lang about this, and I sort of agree. When some of us think of beginner books, we tend to think of these ones that really start with square one, and they are not assuming that you know anything. So what I think of as a beginner book has to be something that makes no assumptions about what you already know. It has to be something that explains everything every step of the way. And when I say everything, I don't mean that it has to cover every topic ever in witchcraft all in one book. But what I mean is that whatever it is covering, it must cover step by step, assuming nothing. When I come across books that are billed as beginner books now, that I read through and I see that they're kind of skipping over entire concepts or just glazing or glossing over, when there is clearly more to be said about a basic thing that they are skipping, I no longer think of that as beginner friendly, because it's not helping you learn, essentially. So if something labels itself as beginner but isn't actually helpful for someone who doesn't know anything, then I would not recommend it as a beginner book. It may still cover what we think of as basic subjects, but if it's skipping over things, that means it's assuming that you already know some of the stuff. So therefore it can't be beginner. They might think it is. They might think that's what they wrote. But if a person who is a complete beginner, who knows nothing about any of this stuff, can't pick up a book and read it and understand the concepts that it is presenting from point A to point Z in full, then it is not doing what it set out to do. I think that the fact that there are so many beginner books out there is probably why so many books now are skipping things, because in many ways it's kind of safe to assume that people do know these basic things because there are tons of other books out there about the basic subjects, you know. There's a ton of books that will talk to you, that will teach you, that will tell you, whatever, in which you will read about how to cast a circle or what it means or why certain people might do it or might not. Or that might even be an advanced concept, you know, talking about why we cast circle or who casts circle and who doesn't, or who does it one way and who does it another way. That might even be the next step beyond the beginner aspect, which is really just how to do the thing, right? Anyway, there are plenty of books that cover things like that. There are plenty of books that talk about the Sabbats. There are plenty of books that talk about the 4 classical elements and what they represent and such. And so I think a lot of authors now do assume that people know those things because that information is out there. So some authors want to be able to move past that. They want to be able to write books that assume that you already know that stuff. And so they can start at a further jumping off point, you know? So I think that a book that does that is beyond beginner. Again, whether we call it intermediate or advanced will depend on what you think those terms mean. But I think that a book that can safely and confidently begin past those basic foundational materials, and maybe it even tells you that in the beginning of the book, or maybe something about the title tells you, but in some way, I think it's most helpful if those books tell you that they are not a beginner type of thing. They're not attempting to teach you from point A. You know, they want to be able to start a little bit later. I think authors should be able to do that. I think that that's important. However, it can be really difficult also to feel like you are able to do so. Because while there are a lot of beginner books out there, not all of them are great, but also you have no way of guaranteeing that whoever picks up your book and reads it is actually going to be the correct audience or ready for the level at which you've written the book. So what I mean by that is there might be something that's labeled as advanced out there, right? Let's just say there is. That author has no way of knowing whether a complete beginner is going to pick up that book first and try to learn from that book first. Again, I think the most helpful thing that an author can do, a book like that can do, is to tell you right at the beginning, this book is not intended to teach you the basics. You know, I recommend that you read this book after you already have a good grasp on the basics or whatever, right? But even if an author puts in that disclaimer, you know very well that there are going to be people going out and grabbing those books because they say advanced, you know, ooh, advanced material. There are going to be people going out there and grabbing those books and wanting to read them before they are ready. And by before they're ready, I don't mean, you know, obviously there are people who are going to be like, yes, I'm ready for this, let's go, I'm going to do advanced stuff. Like, I don't mean before they think they're ready. I mean before they've actually learned the foundational material that will be necessary to do the things that are in the more advanced book. Or they've learned the basic things, but they haven't taken that maybe intermediate step of really practicing them or working with them for an extended period of time or really integrating it into their personal life and practice, which might be necessary before you move on to the advanced thing, you know? So I think that if I were an author, I would always have that in the back of my mind that, like, sure, I can maybe publish something that will be intermediate or advanced or whatever, but in the back of my mind, I'd always think I feel a slight sense of responsibility to still cover some of the basics just because of that unfortunate reality that you never know when someone's going to pick up your book and try to learn from it. So the best thing that authors can do is make it very clear when that's not what their books are. And I think that that's where things like us reading books and then reviewing them and telling other people about them comes in very handy, because then we can say, all right, you know, I've read this book that claims that it's a beginner book, But as I was reading it, I noticed that it skipped a lot of things, or that it made a lot of assumptions about what the reader would already know. And as such, I do not think it is a complete beginner book. It's not beginner friendly in that way. We can help each other out by sharing some of that information. When people first ask me, what do I think about this concept of where are the advanced books, I think that there might be some things out there, definitely. First of all, because I do believe that it might depend on the person. What you need as the next step in your practice might be something that someone else started with as a beginner. And so therefore, you might be looking for a book that will advance your personal practice, but it might say that it's for beginners. And so you might overlook it because you're like, nah, I'm not a beginner anymore. But you might need the beginning foundation material of whatever that subject matter is that you are trying to add into your practice, So going back to that whole rant that I had earlier, I do think that that is one aspect of why there might be things out there that are advanced for some people, but we don't see them as being advanced because they're also appropriate for beginners. But in another sense, I think that some books, a number of books out there might be more suited for quote unquote advanced practice. But again, I feel that some books, even if they do go beyond those basics, are still feeling a responsibility to cover some of those basics, because we have this sort of issue with, what if people pick up this book as the first book that they ever read, and then what if they haven't learned the foundational material before they get to this book? I still want them to read my book. I still want them to buy my book. So if I want people to be able to pick it up and buy it, even if it's the first book they've ever read on these related subjects, then I kind of feel like I have to cover a little bit of the basics, right? Or there's the aspect of certain books might be talking about more intermediate or advanced material within a specific path, within a specific tradition, a specific way of doing things. And so before they get into the way that they do it, they might have to cover some of the basic material from the perspective of the path they're about to tell you about. So if we think of beginner books as the things that define terms for us and talk about what it means to be a witch or anything like that, if some of those things are what cues us to think, oh, this is for beginners, that is something that would really affect our ability to recognize an intermediate or advanced type of book for what it is. Because it might just be that, again, for example, with Weave the Liminal, Laura Tempest Zakroff might be explaining what these terms mean to her and what this means in this practice, defining what modern means and what traditional means in relationship to modern traditional witchcraft that is being talked about in that book. That's something that might be necessary to understand the further information. And so that's what I think makes something maybe beginner friendly, because if it is the first book that you're picking up about a certain subject and it sort of leads you in and it gives you the, here's how I use this term type of stuff, that helps bring people into it. But I don't think that's what makes a book beginner in and of itself. If you've read beginner books about basics of whatever, but then you go to read a more advanced book by someone of a completely different path or just a completely different tradition or whatever, and they don't redefine what they mean by certain terms, if they know that the way that they use a term is different than the way other people do, then if they don't do that, there's the danger of someone reading a basic book, learning a certain understanding, and then reading this advanced book with that other understanding in mind, not realizing that this author, this path, is now using these terms in a drastically different way, perhaps, than the way you've learned. And so that hinders understanding. So I think that even advanced books may feel a responsibility to cover some of those basic things again, because, again, and as Thorn mentioned, we don't necessarily know what people are reading as their advanced books. So if you are looking to write a book that is further along in the path you kind of have to do so knowing the abundance of differing material out there for beginners and the differing quality of those resources. And so, yeah, there's a lot, I think, to take into account. I think the best example of books that are able to get into intermediate and advanced type of stuff are series that are written by the same author, because they know then that if you have read the series in order from book 1 to book 2 to book 3, then they know exactly what you've been given before that point, you know? Or something that I heard about just recently from an online friend, Eris, was mentioning, I hope it's okay that I mentioned this, Eris, but I want to give you credit for bringing this up, just the idea that some groups have a seeker's reading list or a seeker's book list. And I thought that that was brilliant. The idea that, you know, maybe you have a group, or maybe your specific path or tradition, you know, you're not an author and so you didn't write specific books, but maybe there are specific books that you want people who are getting involved in your group to have read, so that you all have the same foundational knowledge, the same foundational material to start from. So even if it's not a specific series, maybe you have a specific list that you ask people to read through so that you all have that same basic knowledge. And similarly, that is the case with the reclaiming tradition, in that the Spiral Dance by Starhawk is really considered one of the foundational books for that specific tradition and that specific way of doing things. And then there are core classes that are recommended for working within the tradition and within those communities. And so, you know, I read some of the books. I spoke to one of my friends who was also involved in the tradition when I was starting to desire to be more involved in it, and they recommended that the next step for me would be to attend my first witch camp, and I did. And so while I was there, I took the first class, the introductory class that is meant to cover the basics. Even though at that time I was no longer a beginner witch, I was a beginner in this specific tradition. And so it was important to me that I follow that system. And, you know, this is the introductory class. It's recommended for people attending their first witch camp. And also it's just recommended as the introduction to the way that that tradition does things. And so I did it. I took a class about casting circle and learning about the elements, even though that's something that we consider so basic, and I first learned about it 15 years ago. Here I am, approximately 10 years later, taking a class on it, and guess what? I learned a whole lot of stuff. You know, like, returning to that foundation material is important, and also it depends on how we learned that foundational material. We're learning it from new teachers, we're learning it within the context of a different tradition. So yeah, depending on what advancing your own practice means for you, you might be going back to the basics and learning them from a completely different angle. And so from there, I learned about the other core classes within the tradition, and I've been slowly going through those, and you know, these are the things that you do. This is the way it works. And like, so for me, the next step for me, other than finishing up those core classes, I decided to try to develop local community in my area so that I could take more part in the community-based work and the group-based work that is such a part of it. And, you know, until I can attend another witch camp or until I can attend the other classes, what's another thing that I can be doing to advance my knowledge of that? Well, I decided read all of Starhawk's published work, because I wanted to go back and see, you know, what are the other things that are already out there in the world that are about and that are from within this tradition that I am interested in deepening my practice with. So it felt natural to me to say, okay, well, here's the author of the introductory book, and they've written a bunch of other books. I'm going to read all of those books. And that's what I did this year. And so the next step for me, having read all of those, will be to read materials written by other teachers and authors within the tradition that are not that author that I've already read everything from. So branching out to read the other authors, branching out to read more about the other paths and traditions that influenced this tradition. So like Thorn was saying in their videos, going back further, going to the history, if you want a fuller understanding of the background and the depth of something that you're getting interested in or wanting to advance further in, it's good to know what's already out there about it. So that's a way that I sort of personally developed my own sort of path, again, from point A to point B or point A to point Z. What's your end goal, or what's your goal for this period of time? And that's going to be different for everyone. The books that I read this year may not be considered advanced material, but for me, they were the natural next step and the natural path for deepening into what it was that I wanted to deepen into. So yeah, for you, it's going to be different. And just as far as where are the advanced books, I think that it doesn't really matter whether a book says beginner, intermediate, or advanced on the cover, unless it's part of a series that specifically wants you to read in a certain order so that it knows by the time you get to book 4, you've already read and worked through and worked with the concepts of books 1 through 3. In those instances, I think it does matter the label that they put on it, because you don't want to skip to book 10 before having read the first 9, because they intend for you to do things in a certain way and build on the material that you've learned. But also, side note, there tends to be a desire among a lot of us who are avid readers, maybe especially, but just a lot of people, there tends to be a desire to read a book, and as soon as you've read the book, say, okay, what's next? And skipping the part where we should also be working with the things that we learned, actually doing the exercises that may have been given, actually practicing the things, incorporating them into our daily lives for an extended period of time, and until we feel like they are really integrated and we understand them enough to move on to the next step. And if we don't have a specific mentor or a teacher to be able to evaluate us and say, okay, yes, you are ready for the next step, or no, not quite yet, go back and work on this a little bit. Without having those types of relationships in our lives, it can be very difficult. And so that's why, for me, several years ago, I felt like, yeah, how do we know if we don't have a teacher or a mentor or a specific system that we're following? How do we know where we are? And I sort of went into the bookstore with this intention of, how do I know how far I am in my path? And I found this book here, The 12 Wild Swans by Starhawk and Hilary Valentine. And it is set up into a sort of series of building on the previous things that you've learned. So it's set up, and again, it's reclaiming tradition specifically, so it's not going to be relevant to all of you. But what I'm saying is that it's something that I found that I was interested in that was perfect for me at the time, because it does lay out, this is what we consider the basic foundation material. This is how we move on to the next steps and integrating things into our lives. And so this is kind of the work that we would look to do next. And then once you've got all of that down, and you might even go back to the basics and do it again, whatever, however many times. Once you've got those certain things down, then here's what we would consider the next step after that. But aside from having a single book that takes you through those steps, or a series of books that takes you through those steps and intends for you to follow them in a certain order, knowing all the while that some people might completely ignore that. Aside from that, we have to do our own determining, our own discernment of what is next for us. Something that feels very beginner to you might be the next step for someone else, because maybe they've had no exposure to it. Something that feels very advanced for you might seem completely beginner to someone else. And that, I think, is one of the most difficult things about being a solitary practitioner who is following no specific tradition or path, by which I mean no path work that is shared by other people. If you're really just doing your own thing, then it's really up to you to decide what's next for you. And a book that says advanced on the cover may or may not help at all at that point, depending on who you are, where you are, and what your end goal is. So this has been a ramble, as I'm sure you're used to by now from me. Thank you so much for watching and or listening, and definitely let us all know in the comments what to you signifies a beginner book, and what would you maybe be looking for in a book that would tell you that it's meant to be intermediate or advanced for everyone, you know, across the board considered advanced. What would it have to do or say in order to be seen that way by you, and accurately so, not like the ones that claim they're beginner but then skip a bunch of things, you know, something that truly is what it says. What would it have to do or say in order to be seen as intermediate or advanced work suitable for everyone across the board? Does that even exist? Or can we never expect that to happen in a very general sense, but only in very specific traditions or pathwork where there's perhaps a series of books that tells you this is how this group does it, and that's really the only way we can expect that to happen? And what else? What else do I want to know from you? Maybe if you feel up to it, you know, we're in December, so we're coming up on a new calendar year. It's a time when some people like to make new goals and things like that for a new calendar year. We are also past Samhain in the Northern Hemisphere, so anyone who considers that a new year sort of time period, this is a good point in time maybe to share if you've already been thinking about it. Do you have any specific goals for the trajectory of your own spiritual practice over the next 300 to 500 days or whatever, you know? What are you currently working on, and what do you think might be the next step for you at this time? And I think certainly if it's something that seems rather beginner, don't feel bad about that, because as I just made very clear, I think that a lot of the time the next step can be going back to the beginning of something completely separate that we haven't learned yet. Just because I've been doing this for approximately 15 years doesn't mean that when I want to start learning something entirely new, I can start at the level of someone who's been doing that thing for 15 years, you know? So I think we're always going back to beginnings in many ways. But yeah, anything in that realm that you'd like to share in the comments or let us know, please do. And yeah, I will see you next time. Until then, don't forget to be awesome, blessed be, and goodbye.